Yeah, it's been a while since we last touched a Mega Man game. Not that there's much left for me to touch at this point, but we never actually did a video on this, did we? Let's get that out of the way.
Some quick backstory before we get into it. 1997 saw the 8th main Mega Man game grace Sony PlayStations and Sega Saturns all around, but realizing that some folks held onto their Super Family computers, Capcom releases Rockman and Forte, aka Mega Man and Bass, exclusively to Japanese audiences for the Super Famicom in 1998, a 16-bit Mega Man game with Mega Man 8 assets recycled along with some other bits and bobs. This was essentially the Dracula X to Mega Man 8's Rondo, except in this case, the rest of the world got the superior title. Roughly 4 years later, the game would eventually see a worldwide release, as Mega Man and Bass would grace the Game Boy Advance in 2002. And this would have been the first time most people would have the chance to play this had they not dwelled into imports or emulation at the time of release. It may or may not have also graced a virtual console at some point. Beyond that, as of this recording at least, the game has not seen a re-release in a long while, making it one of the few Mega Man games that has yet to grace a Legacy Collection compilation of any kind. But I'm sure once Capcom is out of old Mega Man stuff to rehash, they'll get around to bringing this out of the woodworks sooner or later. Or maybe they'll just rehash the old shit again because that always sells. Or maybe they'll actually make a new one that isn't just a shitty mobile game port. Just saying. Anyway, we've already covered the Super Famicom original years ago. I don't have the heart to do it again. I really don't. But to recap, Mega Man and Bass was a game that used assets from Mega Man 8 to make a new game. You had two playable characters, Mega Man, who plays like Mega Man always does, charge, shot, slide, no useful utility items to help out, and Bass, who shoots in 7 directions, has a dash and double jump ability, and can eventually get a flying thing that lets him overcome obstacles easily. Either way, you pick your stage as you play through some of the gimmicks that range from obnoxious to wondering who designed this shit and why are they allowed to live, collect screws to purchase items from the shop that may or may not increase your chances of survival, collect CDs to fill up an arbitrary database, beat your robot masters, gain their above-average weapons, and face off against the final 3 levels of the game, 2 of which are basically extended boss rush marathon levels that you'd have to survive without the benefit of E-tags or proper rush accessories because they're not in this game, and basically that's the gist of this relatively frustrating thing that happens to exist, and that's pretty much Mega Man and Bass in a nutshell. This is a game that, in its original incarnation, had its moments, but also had plenty of issues and questionable design choices that kept it from being one of the top-tier Mega Man titles. I think for a time, its import-only status brought about a certain mystique because not many people got to play this one until they dabbled in the evil art of emulation, or until this GBA port was a thing. And once people played it, it was like, eh? The Game Boy Advance port of Mega Man and Bass is, for all intents and purposes, the same game you would have played on your Super Famicom, but not entirely. I'll get the gameplay bits out of the way quickly because that's the one thing that made it through relatively unchanged for better or worse. Control is still pretty spot on and feels pretty good for the most part. Well, if you're playing Mega Man at least. Controlling Bass is a bit more of a hindrance because you need to double tap the dash, since the GBA has fewer buttons than the standard SNES gamepad, and while I don't mind double tapping the dash since I tend to do that anyways, the option to not have a dash button or map a dash button is something that's going to sting a bit, for some people at least. The shop system is still a thing and you could grind for screws if desired to purchase useful items to help you out, somewhat. The more bosses you take down, the more items are available for purchase, which is a bit of a hindrance, but I guess it makes... No, it doesn't. I hated this from the start. You still have that weird boss tree gimmick that makes no sense even today, but it does narrow down which bosses are weak to what if you pay enough attention. CDs are still a collectible to fill up a database, and for a time, it's a nice little bonus that does a little world building for whatever that's worth. Like the original version, you have a save system that allows you to save your progress, up to 4 slots in this version, I believe. New to this GBA version are checkpoint autosaves. Whenever you reach a checkpoint, the game will create a temporary save point that lets you continue from that point if desired. But this gets overwritten every time you cross a checkpoint, and once you load from this autosave, it's gone for good. This does have the side effect, of course, of having the gameplay interrupted for a second or two while saving is in progress, but is a nice little convenience for those on-the-go sessions. In terms of the gameplay, the level design, all that stuff, Mega Man and Bass made the transition to the handheld format relatively unscathed. Save for fewer buttons, everything that was in the Super Famicom original is also in this GBA version, so if you've played that version many times, this should be relatively old hat. Well, save for one glaring and obvious setback that ruins the whole thing, which didn't need another thing ruined that hasn't already been ruined by, well... So back in the olden days of VHS videotape, when they would put movies that originally graced movie theaters and cinemas onto home video, the way they'd make the widescreen image fit onto your square TV, aside from just squishing the full image in there and leaving you with black bars above and below, is that they chop up the sides so that you'd have a full picture filling the screen. This is a process they used to call pan and scan. That is Mega Man and Bass on the Game Boy Advance in a nutshell, except the sides being chopped off are the top and bottom of the screen to fit the more horizontally wide GBA display, thus allowing the game to retain its full-size graphics. Now for what it's worth, the graphics do look good, save for some colors being washed out here and there and some of the visual effects not quite being up to snuff, but on a whole, it's not too bad looking for assets that were originally ripped from the PlayStation 1. However, the consequence of the resolution retention is that as a result of the smaller GBA display, you have a much smaller field of vision, because everything is zoomed in even further, which gives you even less of your surrounding to see, which makes the platforming in some of these levels, which were already troublesome and irritating in the home version, because one of the issues I had with the Super Famicom original is that everything just seemed bigger here than on the PlayStation, which resulted in some tight corners and even tighter platforming bits that end up being a bit troublesome to say the least. We'll add some screen crunch to the mix, and you've got some truly frustrating moments that prove to be a true pain in the rectal cavity. Yes, the camera moves slightly when you're moving within the segment, but that's of little help because if you're on the top part of the screen, then you're not seeing the bottom part of the screen, which may or may not be home to several insta-kill spike beds and bottomless pits. Action that was part of the scene before now happens off-screen, which means the possibility of more cheap hits increases, and yeah, I'll be honest, I couldn't be bothered to get through the whole thing. That last stretch with the king levels and the marathons, yeah, that's still bullshit, and now even more so with the lack of visibility. Even when the game does its best to lay focus on the center where most of the action takes place during the boss battles, it still feels a bit cramped. So yeah, the screen crunch kills this version for me. Not that there was much to kill in the first place, because Mega Man and Bass, even with a full view of the room, was already a shaky title to begin with, and while some would commend Capcom for keeping the game true to form in the transition from Super Famicom to GBA, this is one of those rare cases where a rework of sorts would have made the game more palatable to anyone who just wants to play good Mega Man. And Mega Man and Bass, in any form quite frankly, is simply not good Mega Man. The audio front isn't too bad actually. The music obviously takes a bit of a hit due to the lesser GBA sound processing, and some folks tend to be down on the music as a result, but honestly, I actually prefer some of the tracks interpreted in this version over the Super Famicom original. I feel the lower tech probably helps in giving these tracks a bit more texture than they had originally. Mind you, Mega Man and Bass isn't one of my preferred soundtracks in general, but there's a couple good tunes in there, and the GBA takes are fairly competent interpretations. The sound effects more or less sound the same as they did on the original version, maybe a little rougher sounding at times, but again, not too bad. Oh boy. Whoever was wishing for Capcom to localize Rockman and Forte back in the day was probably doing it on a monkey's paw, because Mega Man and Bass on the Game Boy Advance is not the ideal means of playing this game. For what it's worth, the GBA port is a solid conversion all things considered, as the gameplay and levels have been more or less retained in the portable format, and it does play well enough at times, but ultimately, it's the screen crunch, the restricted visibility, that sinks Mega Man and Bass on the GBA. It's the one thing you have to overcome in order to be able to fully overcome all of the other issues that plagued this game, even in its original 16-bit format. Regardless, if you're insistent on giving Mega Man and Bass a try, your best bet is to go for the Super Famicom original. It's not great, but it's better than... Actually, in this case, I would have preferred nothing.